And we just finished yesterday going through all the 8 limudim. How we know Sai by Shchita, Sai by Kabbalah, Sai by Halacha, and Sai by Zrika, how we know that with the Tchila there's an issue with Shinu Kodesh, and the Tchila there's an issue with Shinu Vailim, and we rely heavily on the Hekish, that's Makish, all of the Karbonis together. So we Makish all the Karbonis to Shlomim, and by Shlomim we learned that you have to have them Lishma. Then there was the discussion that we had that Rish Lakish asked while he was lying on his stomach. We had a discussion about Osham. Osham was also the kapara, so Rish Lakish didn't understand how is it possible. Where do you ever find in the Torah that it's for kapara and it's not maratah, but it'll still be kosher? So they brought a rye from Yerledes, and we had a big discussion around that. The Gemara seemed to have settled on that the fact that it's exersa kosov. By chatos it says chatos who. To tell you dafka the chatos has to be lishma, and if it's not, it's possible. Mashenka the osham would be kosher, and even though it says who by osham, it doesn't say who by the shchita. It says it by the akrava, and we learned that akrava gufa, the akrava sa'imurim gufa is not even makiv. So you can't say that it has to be lishma in order for the carbon to be kosher, because you don't even have to have that krava at all, and the carbon would be kosher anyway. So the Gemara ended up saying that who for Osham is to tell you that Osham shenitik l're'iyah v'shachtes tam kosher. Normally, what are you supposed to do with an Osham that you can't bring? It's roya achi is toiv, and then it's sold, and with the money, with its proceeds, you buy another animal. What happens if that's not what happens? What if they actually shechted the actual animal for a carbon? So Zog to Gemara, once it's already designated by Bezdin that it has to be sold, so it's nitik from the Oshim. At that point, even if they shechted it, it's a kosher carbon, and they can continue processing the carbon. I believe that's what we ended off with last year, with yesterday, and we are up to Yosy Rav Nachman the Rav Sheshes the Yosy Rav Ada bar Masna Gabayu. We had this trio of Rav Nachman, Rav Sheshes, and Rav Ada bar Masna. The Yosy Vika Army, and they were discussing the following. Thank you so much. That Rabbi Lozer said when he responded to Rish Lakish, he said, "Motzinu b'voyin la'achamisa shein kesherin." You do find karbonas that are boy la'achamisa, and they're kosher karbonas, but the ein merat, but they're not merata l'baylim l'shem chayv. So that's what Rabbi Lozer responded to Rish Lakish. Lemale Rish Lakish, you know what Rish Lakish should have responded? He should not have accepted Rabbi Lozer's response. He should have rejected it as follows. Hananami laisi belirtzu. Maybe they should be maratza. How do you know that they're not maratza? Maybe they should be maratza. All the karbonis that you're quoting, you bring them, and they should be maratza also. Zokt Rashi, Hanunami laisi belirtzu are yorshim. Let the yorshim of the carbon of these oilers, let it be maratza for them. Amr lahen Rav Ada bar Masna, I don't understand. We have an oila that's supposed to be brought by Yerledes. So she dies, and now they bring it. So they're going to be maratza al Yerledes. Im hi yolda bana mi yoldu. She gave birth. She needs the ritzui. How could a carbon that's supposed to be maratza on a Yerledes work for a generic work for the child who didn't have a baby? Maskal Florabasi, I don't understand. Sure, it could be maratza. Because what is an oil maratza on? An oil is maratza on someone who is over a mitzvah say, and it's on someone who's over a lav hanitik lasei, which doesn't get malchus. So zok the Gemara, uman leimalam, buy a chatos, where the Torah specifically says if you do this avera, you bring a chatos. If you do this avera, you bring an osham. So there, each chatos is for the specific avera. But it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah specifically that an oil is for an assay. We know it's for an assay, but it's not prescribed that way. So if that's the case, uman le malon the ika kama se gabo lo mischapra. When the Yoledis brings the carbon oila, who said that it's exclusively mechaper only on the fact that she's a Yoledis? Maybe if she has any other violations of assays or violations of lavanit asay, it would be mechaper for those. So therefore, the chivon the chiika kama asay gabo mechapra, since this carbon of oil is a general kapara for this suga of avera, yershel nami mechapri. Sure, they're not Yoledis. Mask, they didn't have children, but they still have probably an Isra say that they were over, a lav anikla say that they were over, let the carbon oil from their mother work for them. That was the taina that Rish Lakish could have responded to Rabbi Loza. Zokt the Gemara, this whole suggestion is based on Lemember the Kanilu. Surely you have to be Kani the carbon, you have to own the carbon in order to suggest that the carbon would be a kapara for them. As Rashi says on the third wide line, Lemember the Kanilu, Liyorshim Behemas carbon avian. The kapara is the kapara life. You're asking that should be mechaper for the children, so you have to say that they actually yashin it. So the question is, a carbon of someone who dies, does it remain in the estate, so to speak, or does it actually transfer to the ownership of the children automatically? And if you want to say that it's mechaper for the children, logic would dictate that they have to be kohen mamish. But I'll prove to you that they're not kohen the carbon, because we Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now we know the halacha is a carbon mincha may not be brought by shutfim; it can only be brought by an individual. Other kabbalas, two people could chip in and say we want to bring a carbon oil, but no two people could chip in and say that we want to bring a carbon mincha. So what happens if he niach mincha l'shnei v'anavumeis? What if somebody had set aside a mincha that he was going to bring, and then he died, and he has two children yashining him? Now the problem is if they yashin it, if it belongs to them, you can't bring the carbon mincha anymore because two people can't bring the carbon mincha. So what is halacha? Kreva, you could bring it. We don't call it a mincha shutfim. Why? Because it still remains in the estate. It's still the father's carbon. If you're going to hold that the children are kanyat, and that's why the oil of their mother should be able to be mechaper for them, then they shouldn't be able to bring the carbon mincha, because nefesh amar achmana, by mincha the Torah says nefesh, only one nefesh, not two shutfim. So Zokt Gemara, so what do you want to say? V'loi kanilu? From this case of mincha, you want to prove that the children are not kainet? I'll bring you a brisa that shows you punk v'keret. What if somebody had a behema, a carbon? He designated a carbon oil and he died. Now, what do the children do? Kreva, they could still bring market the carbon. So that doesn't show us anything yet. But the ein mamirin ba, they can't talk to a tamura. Now the halacha is a tamura could only be done if you're an individual and you own a carbon. You could do a tamura. Now when I say you could do, it doesn't mean it's permissible. Avad it's usher, but it will be effective. It will work. Bashenkin, if two people have a carbon b'shutfis, we have a positive that tells you they can't do tamura. What does the bride say about this carbon? It's crazy you can be makrid. The ein mamirin ba, they cannot make tamura. If they can't make a tamura, then it must be that they're koinit. Because if they're not koinit, then they should be able to make a tamura, because it still belongs to the individual, belongs to the estate. I'm sorry? We're not talking about a mincha, we're talking about a regular carbon.
No, here it's on the regular carbon. But before we found going.
That's correct. But whether or not they yarshened it, if they yarshened it, it's going to be a shut v'sai by a mincha and sai by a behema, right? And if they didn't yarshen it, it's not going to be a shut, not by a mincha, not by a behema. By a mincha, the impact of shutfim is you can't bring it at all. By a behema, the impact of a shutfim, you could still bring it, but they couldn't make a tamur if they wanted to. There is. But that's not. But still proves we still have a raya that they must be shutfim. If you hold their konyet, now they're shutfim, how you day mamirimba? That will explain why they can't make a tamura, because now this is called a behemah shel shutfim. A behemah shel shutfim, you cannot make a tamura. V'shutfim loy motzu mamirin. If you're going to say when someone dies, the children are not koinit and it sort of remains in limbo in the estate of the father, let them make a tamura because this is not considered a behema shel shutfim. Zok to Gemara, you're right. It's not kali lahu, and it's not considered a behema shel shutfim, but it's still also to make a tamura. Why? Because shiny hasam the amar kra im homer yomer. L'Rabbis, it's a Yerush. A Yerush could make Tamura, but only Echad Meimer, Veinstein Mamirin. So even though they weren't coded yet, we have from the pasuk of Homer Yomer telling me that even though it's not a Beit Mishal Shutfim, it still belongs to the estate. But if there's two Yerushim that are going to Yarush this estate, it still would not allow Tamura. So what is the maskana over here? The maskana over here so far is that when someone dies, the carbon is not nikne to the children. If the carbon is not nikne to the children, so then going back to what Rabbi Lazar said, the carbon is not nikne to the children, the children wouldn't be able to have ritoy. So Rish Lakish's question was, or the question that the Gemara is saying Rish Lakish should have asked to reject Rabbi Lazar's taina was that if it doesn't belong to the children, how could I'm sorry? So the Rish Lakish says, why can't the children use it? Let it be maratza on a say that they did. The teretz is that wouldn't work. Why wouldn't it work? Because they're not koinit. So that's the maskana that we're blinding with right now is the children are not koinit and therefore can't be maratza for them, which is what Rabbi Elazar said. Maskav lo Rabbi Yaakov min nahar pekoid. Frank Rabbi Yaakov from nahar pekoid. Elamayata. Gabi Meiser d'chsiv. By the halacha of Meiser, it says as follows. So we're talking about someone who's being poida his Meiser sheni. If goyel yigo, if you're goyel Meiser, if goyel yigo ishmi Meiseroi, the halacha is you're Moshe Chomish. So if you're poida somebody else's Meiser sheni, you don't have to add a Chomish. You don't have to pay a 20% premium. But if you're poida your own Meiser sheni, you have to add a 20% premium. What if you are being paid the Maisa of your father? From Goyal Yigal to double lotion, L'Rabbis es a Yerush. It's being marred by Yerush. So Frank the Gemara, Hachanami. From Homer Yomer, we learned that it only applies to a single Yerush, and a Yerush could make Tamura, but it doesn't apply to Shutfim, right? So maybe the lotion of Goyal Yigal by Meiser, let's say it also only applies to a Yochid, not a Shutfim. So it says that he pays an extra fifth. Hachanami echad goyel ve'ein shnayim goyelim. Are you going to tell me that this halacha that the children are also Moshe Chomish only applies if there's only one Yerush, but if there's two Yerushim, they wouldn't be Moshe Chomish? Zok Gemara, no. Shiny Meiser the Gabe Avuin Nami Isei B'Shutfus. The whole concept Tamura we know. An animal of a shutfus, there's no din tamura. But Meiser Sheni, what if lechatchila you own Meiser Sheni, the shutfus with somebody else? You were a shutf in a field and you grew it and you planted the field together, and now you're a shutf in Meiser. There the halach is, even though you're a shutf, you do pay an extra chaimish. So therefore, your children, if they're shutfim, they would also add an extra chaimish. So that's why by Meiser you wouldn't make such a limit of Mgal Yigal to exclude shutfim, because we know that lechatchila shutfim also add a chaimish. Amr le Rab Asi le Rab Ashi. I don't know how a Litva could pronounce this. Amr le Rab Asi le Rab Ashi. Umina. Now that we've introduced the Bais of Tamura, well, let's bring a raya from the Bais of Tamura itself. If you're going to say that the children are koine the behema of their father, hainu dechad miya meimer. That would explain why at least one of the children could make a tamura. So if there's only one child and he asks the behema from his father, that's a carbon, he could make a tamura. If you're going to say that the child is not koine, heichi meimer, how could he do the tamura if it doesn't belong to him? A very important rule. Hamakdish moisev chaimish. The halacha is that what happens if a person made a neder? Harei olai olam. And you know what happened? his friend came along and said, my friend Yankel said, I'm going to stel to the animal. And he stel to the animal. And now the animal got a mum. So normally, if you have an animal that you made for a carbon and it got a mum, and now you want to be paid it, you have to add a 20% premium. Here, the animal was not paid for. It wasn't offered up by you. Your friend offered it up to help you be mekayim your nether. So when it gets a mum and you want to be paid it, who is considered the owner of this carbon? Will the real owner rise to pay what's the benefit of being the owner? Is that when you're paid it, you got to pay a 20% premium. Who has this benefit? The person who paid for the carbon or the person who is going to be Yosy with the carbon? So Zokt Rashi, the person who paid for the carbon, he's the one who, if he's paid it, he adds a 20% premium. But if the recipient of this animal is a mechalet enoi moisef choimish. Why? The Torah says, you know who pays the choimish? The one who has makdish the animal. Okay, so let's see what it says. So I'm sorry, Rabbi Yochanan said hamakdish is moisef choimish, but umiskaper oised temura. Why? The EU have a bailim didei, Rashi says. So this ownership of this carbon is sort of split. The Baal was zugestellt from the makdish pays the choimish. But who's the owner? Lagabe hilchos temura, the mischaper is. And the Torah mishaloi al shel chaveri. What if your friend has a whole bunch of tevel, and you take your own tevel and you say, I'm mafresh my tevel to be misakin his tvua? So the halach is now it becomes truma, becomes meiser. Who has the right to give this away? Because I want to give it to my pet kohen, to my pet Levi. My Adam's a kohen, I want to give it to him. But the owner of the tvua, who we were matir, he wants to give the truma to his pet kohen. The halach is the person who's giving the truma, he is the one who has the right to determine who the truma will go to. So the problem that we have over here is, how could you say that it's loy kani lahu? How could you say that the children aren't kainit and therefore they won't have ritzui? We know that if there's only one Yerush, he could make Tamura. If he could make Tamura, it must belong to him. How do I know? Because it says beferish umischaper oisha Tamura. The owner of the carbon makes the Tamura, so he must be the owner of the carbon. So he must have Yarshin. Zok to Gemara. This is going to be a real dakistic chiluk offered up in Kachim over here. Mikiva loy mechapra, mikufra mechapra. When you have an animal that someone is yarshaning, it's a little bit in the twilight zone. It has characteristics of a complete kinyan to the owner of the carbon, but it also has characteristics of its father's estate. And let's hear how Rashi explains this. It doesn't mamish transfer into the reshus of the Irish. Therefore, Hilchach, this will explain why Gabay Minchok Sherili Kayev the Lav de Shutfim. It's not considered a carbon shel shutfim to the extent that now it's owned by two brothers rather than by the one father, and that would disqualify the carbon. No, we still say it's somewhat hovering by the father. It's owned by an individual, and you could be makar the carbon milka. Avol kapara kufya vitzafya memela, but the kapara is sort of hovering. The kapara is hovering to see where it can find a place to land. Avol kapara kufya vitzafya memela yeshlan. It does have that the hilchach meimer, and therefore, if it's only a yochid, he could make the tamura. So it's like a little bit in the twilight zone. On the one hand, we consider it still by the father, but on the other hand, we consider it by the child, and therefore the child could make a tamura. So that I'll have to leave the Dakistic explanation of exactly the situation of this carbon that's in between two generations. I'll have to leave that to the Rashivas and the Lamdonim. I can't even leave it to the Briskers, where Dafov is way past where the Briskers would ever hold. I was speaking to Chaim Simar Gulis yesterday. I said, I need a shot in this Gemara. So he says, sorry, that's like way past Brisk, even 2 Ibrayers. Even if they had 4 others, they wouldn't get up to that 12. So I can't help you there. What's that? I have no idea. Zok the Gemara weiter. Iboilahu. Kipru al mashabu oy loy kipru. Zok Rashi. Kipru al mashabu. Kachim shenizbechu shaloi lishma. The kachim were nizbechu shaloi lishma, which is exactly what we've been discussing since the beginning of the Masechta. But the karvu, we were makrib them. Utnan, and the Mishnah tells us loy olu l'shem chayva, right? And therefore, v'tzorach lo v'yacher. Someone said arei loy oila, and the shoichet of the carbon shechted it l'shem shlomim. It's a kosher oila, but the original person who said arei loy oila still has to bring another carbon. Miu mi boile, but now the Gemara wants to know im kipru alachet shofar shula. Yes, he has to bring another one. That's what the Mishnah says. But Lemais, he was over an essay. Did he get his kapara for that essay? What's enough convenience? Bring another one anyway. Do we say that when they're continuing to be makiv this oila, even though it's like oila and he still has to bring another carbon, but at least he'll have the kapara of it, and therefore he could stay calm until he has a chance to bring the other carbon? Or do you say there's no kapara at all, and now he has to really move fast to get another carbon going to acquire his kapara? So Zok to Gemara as follows. Iboilo, Kipur al Mashabo alo Kipur. Amrab Sheshes. I think the Bach changed it to Rab Shisha. Maray Davidi, Mistavra de Kipur. Logic would dictate that it's not Mekaper at all on whatever he needed to bring it for. The Sol Kedaitach Kipru, because if you're going to say that it is Mekaper, so that it did whatever it has to do, why in the world would he need to bring another one? Sheni Lama Huba. Frek to Gemara, how could you say such a taina? Velamai like Kipru? So you're going to say it was not machaper at all? Well, then lama hukar. How could you continue being makribit? How could you continue processing this carbon if it's not going to accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish? This is what he means to say. If you're going to say that this carbon, the first carbon that was brought Shalom Lishma, will not be mechaper even temporarily for its owner, I would say, why do you bring the carbon? Because when you originally brought this animal, it was Lishmai. In the middle, something went wrong, but it got its kedusha, so therefore you continue to process it. And Visheni Lama Huba, let me just look at the Bach in Oi space. Visheni, who takes the word Lama out, Visheni Huba Lechaper, and the Sheni needs to be brought because the original person who brought this carbon needs his kapara. Aliyamid Kipru, but if you're going to say that the first carbon will be Mechaper, well then Sheni Lama Huba. Why does he have to bring a second one for? There's no reason. He accomplished what he needed to accomplish with it. So why should he bring another carbon? Iboilahu. This shaila, asay de la'acher hafrasha mechapra oiloi mechapra. What is the deal? What if he said arei oila because he was over an essay? Now, unlike a chatas where it's earmarked for a specific avera, the oila is much more general, right? And we already said that the oila could be mechaper for multiple averas that were done until that point. So what's the cutoff? Asay de la'acher hafrasha mechaper oiloi mechapra. He did certain assays, and therefore he was mafresh a carbon oil that he was going to bring. But before he had a chance to bring it, he already did more averas. Until what point will it cover your mitzvahs assays? Do we compare it to a carbon chatos? Ma chatos the koidim afrosha in the la'achar afrosha loy. By a carbon chatos, we know that when you're mafresh the carbon and you designated it for averas that you did, it covers those averas. But if you did any more averas after you designated the carbon, the chatas will not work for it. You're going to have to bring another chatas. It must be, yeah, it must be. That's what I learned from this Gemara. Let's see if Rashi says it. Achatos the lemechaper el shugas kares the koidim hafrasha. But it's mashma you could bring a chatos to cover multiple violations. So Zok to Gemara. So by the oil as well, the koydem afrosha and lach afrosha loy. Oidum oidami lechatos. Why? The chatos I'll call chet v'chet boy yasuye. A chatos has to be brought for each chet. Chad chatos. Now we have to see what that means. V'hacha kivan. Let me look at the gimel. V'hacha kivan. The iika kama. I say gabay. Therefore, mechaper. And it's going to be mechaper. I say the acher afrosha nami mechaper. So let's look what it means if you have multiple chet. Even the ika kama segbe mechaper shorei chiva kosov levia should describe al kol aseva say ladorim ba'olma. So v'nirtzaloi. So no, so it's mashma from here now that that you have to bring a separate chatas for each individual there. Like it says if you eat multiple chelos behel mechad, you can bring one chatas. But if you eat multiple chelos not behel mechad, you have to bring a separate chatas for each one. So in fact, by chatas we know for sure you have to bring a separate chatas for each one. So then, what would be the havamina to bring a raya to compare it to chatas? So I'm not sure because I think I think from the Gemara's second tzad, it's making it quite clear that the chatas is designated for a specific avera, right? But only if it's all behelam echad would you say it could do multiples. So the Gemara says, since chatos you have to bring a separate chatos for each one, there it'll only be mechaper on the asay of koydem afrosha. But the other, which is for a carbon, which is for a big over and say, where it could be mechaper for multiples, maybe even after the afrosha, and we'll see what the cutoff would be. But even after the afrosha, it could still be mechaper.
Just burn from chatas, then it has to be the very that he did before the.
It has to be a very that he did before the afrosha. You can't be mafish in advance. So just like by chatos, the very had to be done in advance. So to here, or no, a chatos is different because the chatos has to be designated for each avera, but an oil doesn't. I hear. Okay, that makes more sense. So klor by chatos, it's only mechaper on one avera. It says v'samach v'nirtza. So it says v'samach yodoy al roisha oila v'nirtza loy lechaper alav. Right, that was the pasuk where Rabbi Ashi learned v'nirtza loy lechaper alav. He learned that it has to be l'shma dizrika, and the Gemara said v'nirtza loy lechaper alav tells you that if you said harei alai and the carbon got lost, you're mechuyev v'nachrayis. Right, that's what we learned 2 days ago. V'samach v'nirtza. Break the Gemara. Let me just look at the Daled. V'chi smicha mechaperes. Right? It says v'samach yodei al reish oila v'nitzel lechaper elav. The smicha is not mechaper, but lo in kapara lebadam. We know the kapara only comes when they spritz the blood. Shenemer ki adam hu b'nefesh yechaper. Elamata medloimer v'samach v'nirtza lechaper. What does the pasuk mean when it seems to be that the smicha makes the kapara? Shem also the smicha l'shiyare mitzvah. If you don't treat smicha with respect and you don't do the smicha, you ignore the smicha. Mala alav akosov ki ilu loy kiper v'kiper. The Torah looks at it as if the carbon was not mechaper, but lemaisa it is mechaper. A very weird expression. If you skip the smicha, it's as if it wasn't mechaper, and it is mechaper. Raja shiori mitzvah shalei nechsheva be'ena v'lo yas. You didn't do it, so it's either like keeper or keeper. A very modern lotion, and that's what the Gemara is going to probe. What exactly does this mean? Zog to Gemara, and I'm just going to read from the Bach. My keeper umay loy keeper. What does it mean when it says keeper and loy keeper? My love, the keeper I say, the keeper I say. The koydem afrosha, the assay that was done before the afrosha, that's what it will be mechaper for. But loy keeper assay the smicha, but it won't be mechaper for him violating the assay that told him he has to make smicha. The halacha that he has to make a smicha is also an assay. By violating it, you'd also have to bring a carbon oil for that. So maybe keeper like keeper means it was mechaper for the original aveir. The oil was oil l'shem b'aylam l'shem chayva, and the oil will be mechaper on the aveir that you were mafresh for. But the aveir that came after that frasha, meaning the aveir that you were over by violating the mitzvah say to make a smicha, that's what it's not mechaper for. Why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't that the carbon be mechaper on the aver that he did a moment before and he didn't do the smicha? You know why? Because it was an aver the lachar frosha. So if I'm doing brayso, you should be able to bring a raya that an aver that was done lachar frosha, the oila will not be mechaper. Omer Rava, I say the smicha kamrit. You're talking about the say of smicha. That's not a raya. Shiny asam the chalkamad lo shachut ba moed v'samach koi. The problem is he didn't violate the assay until it was shechted. Because up until the moment that it checked it, he could still chaparah in a smicha. So therefore, of course, the carbon that he was mafresh won't work for this smicha, because by the time he violated it, it was shechted already. So therefore, you don't bring miraya by other assay. What if he did a different assay? Avada, it should work. So the chalkamet leishachet b'amoid v'samachai. Amos, let's look at the vav to get the Yosy right. Amos have assay. When is the assay violated? Lachash shchita. Lachash shchita like a mebailan. We don't even have a shayla lachash shchita. The whole shayla was before the shchita, after that frosh. So I'm there. Bar Yehuda l'Rava. Emer, maybe that's not pshat and keeper v'lay keeper. You're touching it this way, and therefore you're making a whole big deal out of it. But maybe Emer keeper gavra. Maybe keeper means that lemaisa it worked. Al kol hashay shel biyadai. Maybe it will be mechaper on every aver that he did up until the actual shchita, but what it doesn't accomplish is, but like keeper kamishmaya, it just means that it wasn't a nachas ruach, the carbon, lechiper kamishmaya, nachas ruach lekainoi, the ovid mitzvah min amuk. I'm sorry?
How could it include this?
No, maybe it doesn't include it, but you still can't bring a raya that has to do with the fact that it was after a frosha, because maybe it's going to be mechaper on everything, but it won't be mechaper on the smicha because he wasn't over the smicha till later. But you don't have if it's all totally in before a frosha or after a frosha, so then you have a raya that anything that was done after a frosha, but it's not telling that. It's all about whether it made a nachas ruach or not. This doesn't discuss the Bais is not discussing at all.
Even after.
Correct. Okay. So Zok to Gemara, mi loitnan. I'm going to show you a different example where that's what it means, because it says in the Bais, in the Mishnah, v'hanoitar b'shemen al sher al kafakli. So this is talking about the taharas hamitzayra, where the kohen has to put oil on the thumbs and on the ears, and then the leftovers zok to pasuk. V'hanoitar b'shemen al sher al kafakli yitain al roish hamitayr. The kohen pours it on the head of the mitzayra. So it says Vanoisa, the Chaper Olav Lefnei Hashem. Now, these two psukim quoted are two different psukim. So the Bach tells us that Vanoisa B'Shem Shal Kav HaKoyin, the end of that pasuk is V'chiper Olav HaKoyin Lefnei Hashem, not L'chaper Olav. So Zok Gemara, Im Nosan Keeper, if the shiraim of the oil were poured on the head of the Mitzayra, then it'll be Mechaper. But in loy nosan loy keeper, divi Rabbi Kiva, it's ma'akiv. Rabbi Kiva learns it's ma'akiv. Rabbi Menuri Omer, shiyare mitzvahin, bein nitain, bein loy nitain keeper. Regardless, it will still be mechaper. Umailin olav ki ilu loy keeper. So if you didn't pour the shirayim, it's mechaper, but it's mailin olav ki ilu keeper. What does that mean over there? Ma ki ilu keeper. If you're going to say in this Mishnah by Mitzayah, it means that he has to bring a whole new carbon. It's possible. That's not true, because the Bais says very clearly, Bein Nasan, Bein Loy Nasan, Keeper. Ella, what it means is it must be Keeper Gavra, Loy Keeper Kamishmaya. So over there, the Keeper and Loy Keeper must mean that technically it accomplishes the function that it was designed to do, to be mechaper and the mitzvah, but it's not mitzvah and amukor because you didn't do the noiser b'shem and you didn't pour on the rosh hamitzvah, so it's missing that extra zach. So too by us, that would be the same shot. So you can't bring any rise about the kodim afrosha after afrosha. All it's saying is that it's not a mitzvah minimum. So achanami keeper means keeper gavra and lay keeper means kamei shemai. Hasanami keeper Matan, so Zaktimar, no, you have wrong pshat. That's not pshat. in Kippur and like Kippur in the Parsha of Mitzayir. Rather, Hasam Nami Kippur Matan Bahainos. What did he do? He put the oil in all the Bahainos that he was supposed to do, but he didn't pour the noiser on the head. So Kippur like Kippur means he was Mekayim the mitzvah of Matan Bahainos, like Kippur Matanas Haraish, but he didn't get the extra mitzvah of the Matanas Haraish. And what are you supposed to do? Zok Rashi, v'yovi loy gacher, v'yitin Matanas Haraish. All he'll have to do is bring more oil. It's ma'akif. He'll have to bring more oil and pour it on the head. While Rabbi Kiva holds v'mloy and like Kippur, meaning now you got to do the whole thing all over again. You got to get a whole thing of oil, and you got to put on the Bahainos and on the thumbs. You got to do it all over again, plus the Rosh. In other words, do you just have to now bring more oil to do the Rosh, which would be the sheet of Erechem and Uri, or do you need to redo the whole oil thing? And therefore, you cannot bring a raya from this brisa that Kippur and like Kippur means if it's Klapi Gavra or Kamishmaya. Tashma, Rab Shimon Omer. So we're back to our Shaila. We haven't been punched our Shaila yet. La'achar Afrasha, Veris that were done La'achar Afrasha, will this oil cover for it? Tashma, Rab Shimon Omer, Kivsei Atzeres Lo Mahin Boin. Why do you bring the Kivsei Atzeres? What are they brought? Zok to Gemara, Kivsei Atzeres Shlomim Ninhu. There are carbon shlomim. Zok Rashi. Kivsei Atzeres Shlomim Ninhu. The Hechi Tana Sefer the Milsa, we're really missing. Because when we finish this brisa, the brisa says, you know what the Kivsei Atzeres are brought for? They're brought to be Minchaper Al Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav. This is scratching our memory, reminding us what we had at the beginning of, I don't even remember which Masechta, it talks about maybe Shavuos. It was talking about, the beginning of Masechta Shavuos talked about all the different carbonates that are brought for Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav. So the Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav that the Kivsei Atzeres are mechaper on are if there was no Yediyah, not Bechila, not Pesait. In other words, you were never you were totally oblivious. You were never aware that you violated and you came into the Bais from your Tomei. The Kivsei Atzeres are mechaper for that. So the problem is, how could you say that they're mechaper? They're not mechaper. They're shalomim ninu. They're made just to trigger the kedusha on the breads that are going to be matir, the barley. Ela seirei, or the wheat maybe. Ela seirei atzeres lo mahin bain. The question is not the kivsei atzeres; those are shlomim. The question is on the two seirim that are brought on Shavuos. Those are not connected to the lechem. They're not a shlomim. What are they brought for? Al tumash mikdash v'kadosha. Now you're bringing two karbonos for the very same purpose. Nizrak dama shal rishon. Once they made zrika for the dam of the rishon, so that we got our kapara of tumash mikdash v'kadosha. So sheni lama karev. Why do you need the second one for? Zok Gemara, it must be al tuma she'ura bein zelazeh. It's just in case between the two karbonos there was an aveira of tuma, so that's why we have it again. Emar mayata. So based on that, you could say, Ruin ha Yisrael lahakar of karbonisayim v'chaloisa v'chol shah. Technically, if you're worried about an aveira that happened just in this hour between when they were makar this carbon and makar that carbon, well then every day you have to be worried there's more aveiras. Either wait to the next year when you bring the carbon again, and it'll take care of the whole year, or keep on doing it whenever there's an aveira. So why don't we have to bring karbanos all the time? The Rebbeinu Shem the Rebbeinu doesn't want to deplete all our resources. So he said, bring one a year and you'll be okay. But what are we saying? We're saying that the second carbon is for the same aveira, just in case the aveira was done in between the two. This is for sure not say the achal frasha, because the frasha was Erev Yom Tov before they brought anything. And we're saying it's coming to be mechaper on the averos that were done after the hakrav of one, before the hakrav of the other. But they're both after the afrasha. The mechaper. I would agree if you're talking about a case where Erev Yom Tov together they were mavish them both, and then you're going to ask me why would it be relevant? It doesn't make a difference if it's before that krava, after that krava, because it's after the afrasha. Hakanami, but hakav the afrashinu b'zachar. What the brisa means, that it's to be mechaper on tuma that occurred bein zelozeh, it doesn't mean bein zelazah hakrava. It means bein zelazah hafrasha. If they were mafresh one, and then there was another avera of Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshov, the second one will do it. But frankly, the pasuk doesn't say anything about being makdish them separately. The norm would be the Torah is saying you're making the makdish two before you up them. You're makdish both of them. So v'leiku v'leimalei lakra dechiksiva b'zach hazaksiva. What are you going to tell me when the pasuk says bring two seirim? It's b'dafke if you have to separate afrasha. Doesn't say that. So the chiv is even to be mafresh both together. So then once the chiv is even to be mafresh both together, and the Torah doesn't say specifically they have to be hufresh at different times. So then what do you need two for? Back to the same question. There is no in between. Amar Papa, carbon the Sibur Kamrit. You're asking me from carbon the Sibur? Carbon the Sibur have their own set of rules. Shiny carbon the Sibur, the Lev Bezdin, Kamas Nalayim. Anything that's purchased, that's done for the Sibur is very tightly controlled by how Bezdin structures it. It doesn't matter what you did. It doesn't matter what the agents did. All that matters is how the Bezdin wanted structured. And the Bezdin will say, yeah, you might have been mafresh, two karbonis together, but we're saying that the afresha of the second one should only technically be chal a moment before your makrabit. So it catches all the averes that are in between. Shiny karbonis tibur, the love Bezdin, kamas nalein, k'dir Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, karbonis tibur, sakin moishchoson l'mashahin. You know when they become designated? When they're shechted. Zok Rashi, Lev Bezdin, ha'oiskin b'tzarchi tzibur, the Lev Bezdin that are oiskin b'tzarchi tzibur, masna aleim, creates conditions. Shafilu yafrishim ha'kohanim b'vasachas. Even if the kohanim are going to be mafresh both these seirim simultaneously, loy sehei afrosha so achar nafrosha at samuch lakravosai. They set up the parameters, and they say the afrasha for the second one will not occur until just a moment before it's a krava. Why? So that we can still pick up all of the tumas that are done. So you're going to ask me why do you need the first afrasha? Because we want to have a kapar for the first, but I don't know how that helps. Because if you're the first afrasha doesn't help, because the kapar doesn't come at that afrasha, the kapar comes at that krava. So just bring one. I don't know the answer, but that's what it says over here. So Kavan the Sibur sakin ashoichdom, the sakin that shechs them, moishchason lemashahein reuyin v'imdim. It's the sakin that determines what carbon they're for. Even if the shoich is shechting a carbon of tzibur, and he doesn't even know what he's shechting it for, what's an example of that? They had extra carbon tamidim. And they didn't need them. They took it from the skull from last year. And Nechad B'Nisan came where you're supposed to renew everything and start being makriv karbanos from the money of the next year. If the kohen shechted it, it's good for Ketzim Mizbeach. I shechted it for the carbon tumid. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what he thinks. Lev Bezdin decides what it's for. What do they do with all the extra money? They just buy extra karbanos. So even though he's shechting it and he thinks it's a talmud, it doesn't matter what he thinks. Since they can't be brought as tamidin because they're from the last year's money, you could bring them from wherever they're good for. Why? Mishum the lev bezdin masna aleim that imhotrachu. If these are needed for the carbon tavid, fine. V'imloi, but if they're not needed, the carbon is going to be yikaitu behem esemizbeach. Kabaltik. So Rashi just says as an aside, v'nir beined like garshil al shmuel hacha. We're quoting this halacha in the name of Shmuel, but it can't be the makminla beper karman shvuas aliba demand a lesle levezdin masna aleim. In Gemara Shvuas, it says that Shmuel does not hold of levezdin masna aleim. We'll stop here. We ended up with a new chiddush that anything that's done in the base of Mikdash, it's all done with bezin, the kavanas of the local guy doesn't matter, and therefore the afrasha, the first one automatically is before Shavuos. The afrasha of the second one is only chal a moment before your makrabit. So therefore, the second one could be mechaper on all the averes that occurred between the afrasha of the first and the afrasha of the second. Okay, we'll stop here.